Hybristophilia. In the late 1970s, America was gripped by fear of a serial killer named Ted Bundy. The police described him as a manipulative and extremely dangerous man, but strangely, the more famous his case became, the more women were actually drawn to him. While Bundy was on trial in Florida, thousands of love letters began pouring into the prison. Many women believed that Bundy was actually innocent. Some even willingly stood in line just to see him in the courtroom. This phenomenon is known as hybristophilia, a romantic attraction to dangerous criminals. The most famous case involved a woman named Carol Ann Boone. Boone continued to support Bundy throughout the trial. She frequently attended court and defended Bundy in public. And in 1980, something very strange happened. In the middle of a murder trial, Bundy suddenly proposed to Boone right in the courtroom. Boone accepted, since Florida law at the time considered such a declaration valid if made before a judge. They were officially married in the middle of a criminal trial. The American public was immediately shocked. Psychologists believe that hybristophilia arises from a combination of obsession, pity, fascination with power, and media influence. And to this day, the Ted Bundy case remains the most famous example of how a murderer can still have fans. Because sometimes, monsters don't always look scary. Somnophilia. In Toronto, Canada, a shocking case emerged from a place that should have been the safest for patients. An anesthesiologist became the focus of an investigation after police discovered hidden recordings in a medical area. The investigation subsequently led to allegations of sexual attraction toward people who were unconscious or asleep. This phenomenon is known as somnophilia. In the field of psychology, somnophilia is described as an attraction to someone who is unconscious, asleep, or unable to respond. Because it involves the absence of the victim's consent, cases like this are often associated with serious crimes. The case in Toronto immediately sparked public outrage. Many people find it hard to believe that a medical professional could exploit their position and access. The investigation lasted for months, and the Canadian media continued to highlight how the perpetrator used a closed work environment to conceal their actions. A criminal psychologist noted that cases like this are often linked to an obsession with control and domination, and that is what makes it so terrifying, because victims are often completely unaware that anything has happened to them. This case ultimately became one of the most famous examples of how psychological deviance can turn into actual criminal behavior. Necrophilia. In 1979, a bizarre case shook Sacramento, California. A woman named Karen Greenlee worked as an apprentice embalmer at Memorial Lawn Mortuary. On December 17, 1979, Greenlee was assigned to drive a Cadillac hearse to the cemetery. Inside the hearse was the body of a 33-year-old man. However, before reaching the cemetery, something inexplicable happened. Greenlee suddenly drove off with the hearse. A few days later, police found her in Sierra County, California. She was in a state of depression and was believed to have attempted suicide. Upon examination, police discovered a written confession several pages long. In the confession, Greenlee admitted to his obsession with corpses. This case later became one of the most famous necrophilia cases in America. What made the public even angrier was that, at the time, necrophilia was not specifically classified as a crime in California. As a result, Greenlee was only convicted of stealing the hearse and disrupting the funeral procession. He was sentenced to 11 days in jail and a $255 fine. To the victim's family, the punishment felt grossly inadequate. The case subsequently sparked a major debate about legal loopholes, funeral home ethics, and extreme psychological deviance, because in Greenlee's case, the place that was supposed to be the final space for honoring the dead, instead, it became the site of one of the most shocking scandals in California's criminal history. Blood fetish. In late 1977, the city of Sacramento, California, began to be haunted by a series of extremely bizarre murders. The perpetrator was Richard Trenton Chase, a young man who came to be known in the media as the Vampire of Sacramento. That nickname wasn't given without reason. According to case reports, Chase had an extreme obsession with blood. However, in this case, psychiatrists noted that his impulses were heavily influenced by delusions and severe mental disorders. Not merely a common fetish, Chase believed his body was breaking down, and the only way to survive was through blood. From December 1977 to January 1978, he attacked victims at random in Sacramento. In a short time, 6 people were killed. The case sent the police into a panic because the pattern of the crimes was unusual. There was no clear connection between the perpetrator and the victims. There was no financial motive. There was no grudge. There was only obsession, paranoia, and a terrifying conviction in the perpetrator's mind. Chase was finally arrested on January 28, 1978. As the investigation unfolded, the details of the case shocked the American public. In 1979, he was found guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The Richard Chase case is still frequently discussed in criminal psychology as an example of how delusions, isolation, and an obsession with blood can turn into real violence. Because in this case, blood was not merely a symbol of fear. For the perpetrator, blood was the center of his entire madness, zoophilia. In 2005, a small town near Enumclaw, Washington, suddenly found itself in the American media spotlight. The case began when a man named Kenneth Pinion was taken to the hospital in critical condition and later died. At first, the police thought this was just an unusual death. But once the investigation began, they uncovered something far darker. Pinion was suspected of engaging in illegal sexual acts with animals at a remote farm in King County. The investigation later led to several other individuals, including James Michael Tate. Police discovered recordings and digital evidence, indicating that the location had been used multiple times for similar activities. What further outraged the public was that, at the time, Washington state law did not explicitly prohibit bestiality or sexual acts with animals. Because of this legal loophole, Tate was initially charged only with trespassing, not with a sexual offense against an animal. The Enumclaw case ultimately sparked major changes. In 2006, the state of Washington amended its laws. Bestiality was subsequently classified as a serious crime, carrying a potential sentence of up to 5 years in prison. This case serves as an example of how a single tragedy can expose a legal loophole that had previously been overlooked. Because in zoophilia, the issue is not merely one of sexual deviance. There are elements of exploitation, the animal's inability to consent, and the risk of extremely serious violence. Since the Enumclaw case, many states and other countries are increasingly tightening their animal protection laws, and to this day, this case is still regarded as one of the most disturbing scandals in Washington's criminal history. Acrotomophilia. Unlike the previous cases, acrotomophilia does not always manifest in the form of murder or major crimes. This disorder is characterized by a sexual attraction to people who have lost limbs, such as hands or feet. In the field of psychology, this phenomenon began to be widely discussed through the research of John Money and his team at Johns Hopkins University. They studied people with an extreme fascination with amputations and the bodies of amputees. Within this community, certain terms frequently emerge: devotee, pretender, and wannabe. A devotee is someone attracted to amputees. A pretender is someone who feigns having a disability. Meanwhile, a wannabe is someone who actually wants their own body to be amputated. Cases like this become very complex, as they do not always involve direct criminal activity. However, in some medical reports, this obsession can develop into dangerous behavior. One medical report from 2000 discussed a 49-year-old man with an amputation fetish who eventually mutilated himself after reading instructions online. Researchers note that the condition worsens when a long-standing fetish combines with depression and life stress. That is what makes acrotomophilia one of the most disturbing paraphilias. Because in its mild stage, it may simply be a hidden interest. But in extreme cases, an obsession with a missing body part can turn into a desire to harm one's own body. And at that point, the line between fetish, body image disorder, and medical risk becomes very thin: coulrophilia. Clowns are supposed to be synonymous with entertainment and laughter. However, for some people, the costume, face paint, and character of a clown actually trigger a sexual attraction or a specific psychological obsession. This phenomenon is known as coulrophilia. Although it sounds strange, this term began to be widely discussed after several high-profile criminal cases involving perpetrators dressed as clowns. One of the most famous names is John Wayne Gacy in Chicago. During the 1970s, Gacy was known to the public as a local businessman active in social events. He even frequently performed as a clown under the name Pogo the Clown at children's parties and charity events. However, behind that facade, police later uncovered a deeply disturbing secret life. In 1978, a police investigation led to Gacy's home following the disappearance of a teenager named Robert Peast. When his home was searched, investigators found evidence that made this case one of the most infamous crimes in American history. The media immediately linked the clown image with fear. Since then, a major phenomenon has emerged in popular culture. Many people began to experience an extreme fear of clowns or coulrophobia. On the other hand, psychologists also began discussing the obsessive fascination with clown characters and theatrical makeup. According to some experts, the face hidden behind the makeup can create an illusion of a new identity, mystery, and a sense of psychological dominance. The John Wayne Gacy case changed the public's perception of clowns forever. Since then, many people no longer see clowns as a source of entertainment, but rather as a symbol of what lies hidden behind a fake smile: autoerotic asphyxiation. In 2009, renowned actor David Carradine was found dead in a hotel room in Bangkok, Thailand. Initially, the public suspected his death was linked to a criminal case. However, after an investigation, Thai police stated there were no signs of homicide. Reports later pointed to the possibility of autoerotic asphyxiation. This term refers to a dangerous behavior in which a person intentionally restricts their breathing to enhance sexual sensations. The problem is this practice is extremely risky because in a matter of seconds, a person can lose consciousness and be unable to save themselves. In Carradine's case, the news garnered international attention because he was a major actor known for the series Kung Fu and the film Kill Bill. His family initially questioned some details of his death, but the official investigation still found no evidence of homicide. This case is often cited as one of the most famous examples of how risky sexual fantasies can turn into tragedy. Unlike many other disorders, the greatest danger of autoerotic asphyxiation isn't always to others, but to the person engaging in it. And in many cases, the victim doesn't die because they wanted to die, but because a dangerous game spiraled out of control. Piquerism. Number 2 is one of the darkest paraphilias in criminal psychology, piquerism. Piquerism is a sexual attraction to the act of cutting the skin with sharp objects. In extreme cases, this disorder can be linked to severe violence and murder. One case often discussed in the context of extreme sexual murder is that of Andrei Chikatilo. In the Rostov region of the Soviet Union, Chikatilo lived a seemingly ordinary life for years. He had a job, a family, and did not appear to be the kind of person many would suspect. However, from the late 1970s through the 1990s, police began discovering a series of victims in forested areas, train stations, and secluded locations. This case baffled Soviet investigators, as the pattern of the crimes was extremely brutal and appeared to involve elements of deviant sexual urges. Chikatilo was finally arrested in 1990 and linked to dozens of murders. He later became known as one of the most infamous serial killers in Russian history. In forensic psychology, cases like this are often discussed as examples of when sexual fantasies, sadism, and physical violence turn into a pattern of repeated criminal behavior. What makes piquerism so dangerous is that the object of his arousal is not a relationship, not intimacy, and not consent, but rather pain, injury, and control over the victim's body. That is why piquerism is considered one of the most horrific sexual disorders when it enters the realm of criminal activity. Because for perpetrators like this, the victim's suffering is not a side effect. That suffering is, in fact, part of their fantasy. Necrosadism. Number 1 is necrosadism, one of the darkest patterns of deviance in forensic psychology. This term is typically used to describe a combination of fascination with death, dead bodies, and sadistic elements after the victim has died. It is not a widely recognized diagnosis like sexual sadism disorder, but in modern forensic studies, necrosadism is discussed as part of necrophilic behavior in cases of extreme sexual homicide. One case often associated with an obsession with death is that of Ed Gein, a man from the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin. On November 16, 1957, a shop owner named Bernice Warden went missing. Police then found clues leading to Ed Gein's farmhouse. When the house was searched, investigators discovered a scene that cemented this case in American criminal history. Inside his home, police found various objects made from human remains. The investigation revealed that Gein not only killed, but also dug up graves and brought home body parts from local cemeteries. Gein later confessed to being involved in the deaths of 2 women, Mary Hogan and Bernice Warden. However, the most terrifying aspect of this case was not just the number of victims, but rather his psychological obsession with dead bodies, identity, and control over the afterlife. Gein was initially declared unfit to stand trial, then later found guilty by reason of insanity and spent the rest of his life in a psychiatric institution. The Ed Gein case went on to inspire many famous horror characters, from Psycho to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But behind the cinematic legend lies a far darker reality, that in cases of necrosadism, the victim is no longer even viewed as a human being, but rather as an object of fantasy, control, and obsession that has completely lost all sense of humanity.